If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The creepy uncle and the friend in the car. It started out as a completely normal afternoon. I was walking home from my friend Emily's house, like I'd done 100 times before. She only lived a couple of blocks away, so my parents didn't mind me walking alone as long as it wasn't too late. It was one of those overcast days where the air feels kind of heavy, but I wasn't really paying attention to that. I had my earbuds in, and I remember scrolling through my playlist, trying to decide on a song. That's when I noticed the car. A beat-up, rusty sedan was parked at the corner, idling. I didn't think much of it at first. People park all the time. But as I got closer, I realized the driver was staring at me. It wasn't just a casual glance, either. He was leaning slightly out the window, watching me like he was waiting for something. I pulled one earbud out, just in case he said something, and as I walked by, he waved and called my name. My stomach dropped. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. "It's me, Uncle Jerry," he said, grinning. That's when I remembered. He wasn't my real uncle, just some guy my parents used to hang out with years ago. He was always around when I was little, but we hadn't seen him in years. Something about his smile didn't sit right with me though, and before I could say anything, the passenger door opened, and another guy got out. The guy who got out of the car looked even sketchier than Uncle Jerry. He was tall and skinny, with this greasy black hair that stuck to his forehead. His clothes were too big for him, like he'd borrowed them from someone else, and there was something about the way he moved that made my skin crawl. Kind of jerky, like he was too eager. "Hey, kiddo. Long time no see," he said, grinning in a way that didn't feel friendly at all. I froze for a second, trying to figure out why this random guy was acting like he knew me. Uncle Jerry leaned out the window again and said, "Oh, this is my buddy Dave. We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd say hi." I forced a polite smile and kept walking, hoping they'd just drive off, but Dave started walking alongside me. "Where you heading?" "We can give you a ride," he said, his voice way too casual for how creepy he looked. I shook my head quickly. "No, thanks. I'm almost home," I said, trying to sound normal, but my voice cracked a little. Uncle Jerry laughed from the car. "Ah, come on, don't be shy. We haven't seen you in forever. Your mom would love to know we caught up with you." That's when I started to panic. My mom didn't even like this guy anymore. She told me once that she and Dad stopped hanging out with him because he was trouble. My gut was screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to start running and make things worse. As I sped up, Dave matched my pace like it was a game to him. "Hey, no need to be rude," he said, his tone shifting just enough to make me nervous. I could hear the car creeping along behind us, its engine rumbling low like a growl. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. "We're just being friendly," Uncle Jerry called out from the car. "Your dad would kill me if I didn't make sure you got home safe." Safe? There was nothing safe about this situation. I tried to glance around, hoping to see someone, anyone, on the street, but it was eerily quiet. Even the houses felt empty, their windows dark and lifeless. Then Dave reached out, lightly grabbing my arm. Not hard, but enough to make me stop in my tracks. My whole body froze, and it felt like time slowed down for a second. "Come on, kiddo, don't be like that," he said, his voice dripping with fake kindness. I yanked my arm back and managed to choke out, "I said no, okay?" My voice was shaky, but loud enough that I hoped someone might hear. His smile vanished for a split second, and I caught a glimpse of something darker in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or frustration. Then Uncle Jerry honked the horn, breaking the tension. "Just let her go, Dave," he said, his tone oddly casual, like this was no big deal. I didn't wait to see what Dave would do next. The second Uncle Jerry said those words, I bolted. I sprinted down the sidewalk as fast as I could, my backpack slamming against my back with every step. My legs were shaking so much that I thought they might give out, but adrenaline kept me going. I could hear the car accelerating behind me, the engine revving louder, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. Dave was climbing back into the passenger seat, and the car was speeding up, following me. My mind was racing with what to do next. My house was still a couple of blocks away, and I wasn't sure I could make it before they caught up. Then I spotted a small alley between two houses up ahead. Without thinking, I veered into it, praying they wouldn't see me. I ducked behind a garbage can and tried to catch my breath, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The car rolled past the alley slowly, its engine rumbling like it was hunting me. I could hear Uncle Jerry's voice calling out, "Hey, where'd you go? Don't be silly, we just wanted to talk." I slapped a hand over my mouth to muffle my breathing, terrified they might hear me. The car stopped for a moment, and I heard one of the doors open. My stomach twisted into knots. I thought for sure they were going to come looking for me. I crouched lower behind the trash can, barely daring to breathe. My mind was racing with every worst-case scenario imaginable. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, like someone was scanning the area. "Come on, kiddo," Dave's voice rang out, softer but more menacing now. "We're not mad. We just want to chat." I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping he'd give up and leave, but the sound of his boots on the pavement got closer. I felt completely trapped. There was no way to run without him seeing me, and I wasn't even sure I could outrun him if he did. Then, out of nowhere, I heard another sound, someone else's voice. "Hey, what are you doing back there?" It was sharp and firm, coming from the end of the alley. I peeked around the trash can and saw a man standing there, holding a rake. He looked like a neighbor or a gardener, maybe in his late 50s. Dave froze, his whole body tensing. "Oh, nothing," he said, flashing an awkward smile. "Just looking for my niece. She ran off." The man didn't buy it. "You need to get out of here," he said, raising the rake slightly. "Now." I didn't wait to see what would happen next. The distraction gave me just enough time to sneak out the other side of the alley and take off running again. I didn't stop running until I was at my front door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key in the lock. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My chest felt like it was on fire, and my brain couldn't make sense of what just happened. I peeked out the window, but the street was empty. No sign of the car, no sign of Dave or Uncle Jerry. For a moment, I wondered if they'd given up, or if they were still circling the neighborhood, waiting for me to come back out. I wanted to call my parents, but I couldn't stop shaking long enough to dial. Instead, I sat on the floor and stared at my phone, my mind racing with everything they'd said and done. How did they even know I'd be walking home at that time? Had they been watching me? And what would have happened if I'd gotten in the car? The thought made my stomach turn. I ended up texting my mom a vague message. "Something weird happened on my way home. Can you call me?" She called me right away, and I tried to explain, but it was hard to put into words. She freaked out, of course, and said she was coming home immediately. When my mom got home, she insisted we call the police. I didn't want to at first. I was scared they'd say it wasn't a big deal since nothing technically happened. But when I described everything to the officer over the phone, including how Uncle Jerry used to know my parents, they took it seriously. A patrol car came by that night, and I gave them a description of the car and both men. They said they'd keep an eye out and told me to avoid walking alone for a while. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. The whole time I was talking to the officer, I felt like I was being watched, like they were still out there somewhere, waiting. For weeks after, every time I saw a car that looked remotely like theirs, my heart would start racing. My parents were furious, mostly at themselves for ever trusting someone like Jerry around me in the first place. My mom even reached out to some old friends to see if anyone knew where he'd been living or hanging out, but it was like he'd vanished. The police never called back, either. To this day, I don't know what they really wanted or how far they would have gone if that man with the rake hadn't stepped in. But I still think about it every time I walk anywhere alone. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what if they're still looking for me? The stranger in the car after school. I was 10 years old at the time, just a regular kid growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the late 90s. My school days were pretty uneventful back then. Recess games, homework assignments, and counting the days until summer vacation. My parents had a routine. Mom worked late, so Dad would always pick me up after school. He drove this rusty green station wagon that you could hear coming from down the block, the brakes squealing like an old door hinge. That day, however, he was running late. I waited outside on the school steps, surrounded by the usual crowd of kids chatting or leaving with their parents. As the minutes ticked by, the crowd thinned, and soon it was just me, a teacher locking up the main doors, and the hum of the afternoon breeze. I didn't think much of it when a silver sedan pulled up in front of the school. It wasn't unusual to see random cars waiting, parents coming to pick up their kids, after all. But this car had darkly tinted windows, and something about it made me pause. The passenger side window rolled down, and a man leaned over from the driver's seat. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, with a faded baseball cap pulled low over his face and a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, kid," he called, his voice light and casual. "Your dad got stuck at work. He asked me to come get you. I'm your Uncle Robbie." I froze. Uncle Robbie? I didn't have an Uncle Robbie. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Uncle Robbie wasn't a name that meant anything to me, but I hesitated, staring at the man's face. He didn't look familiar, not even vaguely. Still, I was a kid, and the thought of my dad actually sending someone didn't seem impossible. "Dad didn't say anything about this," I mumbled, standing up slowly but keeping my distance. The man's smile widened, his teeth too white, almost fake-looking. "Ah, I'm sure he was in a rush, buddy. You know how he is. Come on, hop in. We gotta get going before traffic gets bad." He gestured to the back seat, and for the first time, I noticed a stuffed bear sitting on the seat, like he'd thought of every little detail to make me feel safe. But something was off. My dad wasn't the kind of guy to forget to call. And the way this man spoke, it felt rehearsed, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. I took a step back, clutching my backpack straps tight. "What's my dad's name?" I blurted. The man's expression flickered, just for a split second, before he answered smoothly, "Come on, kid, it's me. Your Uncle Robbie. We don't have time for this." My stomach dropped. He didn't know my dad's name. A cold weight settled in my chest, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I shook my head, taking another step back toward the school steps. "No, I'm not supposed to go with anyone unless my dad tells me," I said, my voice shaky but firm. The man's smile tightened, and for the first time, the friendly mask slipped. "Listen, kid," he said, his tone sharp now, almost impatient, "I'm doing your dad a favor. Stop being difficult and get in the car." He gestured toward the door, but his movements were jerky, too eager. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as the man's hand moved to the door handle, like he was about to get out. That's when I remembered my backpack had a whistle attached to it, something my mom insisted on for safety. My fingers fumbled for it, shaking as I raised it to my lips. The sound that burst out was loud, shrill, and cut through the empty schoolyard like a siren. The man recoiled, startled, and for a split second, I thought he might drive off. Instead, his face twisted in anger, and he snarled, "You're gonna regret this, kid," before slamming the car into gear. The tires screeched as he sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and the faint smell of burnt rubber behind. As the car disappeared down the street, I stayed rooted to the spot, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The whistle still hung from my lips, and my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't even unhook it. The schoolyard was eerily quiet now, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. That's when the teacher who had been locking up earlier came rushing back toward me. "What happened? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice frantic. I could barely get the words out, stammering as I pointed in the direction the car had gone. There was a man. He tried to get me in his car. Said he was my uncle. Her face paled, and she immediately ushered me inside the building, locking the door behind us. She called the police while I sat in the office, my knees bouncing uncontrollably as I clutched a lukewarm cup of water she'd handed me. The principal showed up not long after, his usual stern demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "We're going to call your parents right now," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. I nodded numbly, the adrenaline fading and leaving me with a hollow, sick feeling in my stomach. I kept thinking about the man's last words. "You're gonna regret this, kid." What did he mean? Would he come back? My dad arrived about 20 minutes later, his face a mix of panic and relief. He rushed into the office, pulling me into a tight hug without saying a word at first. When he finally let go, his voice was thick with emotion. "What happened, buddy? Are you hurt?" I shook my head, but the words still wouldn't come. I just pointed toward the principal, who filled him in on what I'd told them. Dad's expression darkened with every detail. "Someone pretending to be my brother? What kind of sick person does that?" he muttered, shaking his head. Then he turned to me, his hands gripping my shoulders. "You did the right thing, blowing that whistle. I'm proud of you, kid." The police arrived shortly after, 2 officers in plain uniforms with calm, serious expressions. They asked me a lot of questions. What the man looked like, what kind of car he was driving, what he said to me. I answered the best I could, though I realized how much of the encounter was a blur now. "Did you get the license plate?" one of them asked, and I shook my head, feeling a stab of guilt. "That's okay," he reassured me. "You remembered plenty. We'll do everything we can to find this guy." They stayed for about an hour, taking notes and promising to keep in touch. But as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, the way his smile twisted into anger. The faint sound of his tires screeching away echoed in my mind. My dad had insisted on staying up with me, sitting in the living room with the lights on, flipping through the channels on TV as if trying to distract us both. "Don't worry, buddy," he said, glancing over at me from time to time. "The police are on it. No one's gonna hurt you while I'm around." I nodded, but the pit in my stomach didn't ease. Every shadow outside the window felt like it could be him. The next morning, my dad decided to drive me to school himself instead of letting me take the bus. We pulled into the parking lot early, the station wagon creaking as he parked it under a tree near the front entrance. As we sat there, he leaned over and said, "If you ever see that car again, you let someone know right away, okay?" I nodded, gripping my backpack tight. But as I got out of the car, something caught my eye, a silver sedan, parked at the far end of the lot. My blood ran cold. Was it the same one? I couldn't be sure, but my gut told me it was. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. The silver sedan was just sitting there, engine off, windows dark. It could have been anyone's car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. I turned to look back at my dad, who was watching me through the windshield. He gave me a reassuring wave, probably thinking I was just nervous from yesterday. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder as I walked toward the school entrance. Halfway across the lot, I heard it, a soft click from the car. I whipped around, and my blood ran cold. The driver's side door was opening, and a figure stepped out. It was the man from yesterday. Same cap, same forced smile, but now there was no pretending. His eyes locked onto mine, and his expression was a mix of anger and something worse, determination. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. My legs moved before I even realized it, sprinting toward the school doors as fast as I could. I burst through the school doors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. A few kids milling around in the hallway stared at me, startled, but I didn't stop until I reached the office. "He's here," I blurted, clutching the edge of the counter. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at me like I'd just spoken gibberish. "Who's here, sweetie?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. "The man from yesterday. He's outside." I could barely get the words out between breaths. Her face changed instantly, her calm replaced by alarm, and she picked up the phone. Minutes later, everything was chaos. The principal and a few teachers gathered near the office, whispering in hushed tones, while the school resource officer, a tall, imposing man I usually only saw during assemblies, hurried outside. I stayed by the window, peeking through the blinds, heart pounding in my chest. My dad's car was still there, but the silver sedan was gone. The officer walked the lot, scanning the area, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. My dad was called in again, and I could see the fear etched into his face when he arrived. That afternoon, the police came back to the school. This time, they brought a sketch artist. I sat in the same chair as the day before, trying to describe the man in as much detail as I could. His sharp jawline, the shadow of stubble on his face, the way his eyes never seemed to smile even when his mouth did. The sketch that emerged on the paper made my stomach churn. It was him. The officers nodded grimly, promising once again to patrol the area and keep an eye out for the car. For the next few days, everything felt different. My dad started picking me up early, and he'd stay in the lot until I was safely inside the school. The teachers seemed extra watchful too, their eyes darting toward the windows whenever a car pulled up. Despite all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done. I saw his face everywhere, in the shadows of trees, in the passing glance of a stranger on the street. Even at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard his voice outside my window. A week later, just as things were starting to feel normal again, the nightmares stopped, and I thought maybe he had given up. But then, one evening, something happened that brought it all rushing back. My dad had left the front porch light on when we went to bed, a habit he'd picked up recently, and I woke up around midnight to use the bathroom. As I passed by my bedroom window, something outside caught my eye. A car, parked across the street, just barely visible under the glow of the street lamp. I froze, my hand gripping the curtain. It was the silver sedan. Even in the dim light, I could make out its shape, the distinctive dent on the passenger side door that I hadn't noticed until the second time I saw it. My stomach knotted as I ducked down, my mind racing. Should I wake my dad? Call the police? My heart thudded in my chest as I peeked again. The car wasn't empty. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, motionless, their face hidden in shadow. I crawled away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced with every terrifying possibility. Was he just watching? Was he waiting for something or someone? My dad's words echoed in my head. No one's gonna hurt you while I'm around. But what if that wasn't enough? I tiptoed to my dad's room, trying not to make any noise, and gently shook him awake. "Dad," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "He's here. The car is outside." Dad shot up immediately, his grogginess disappearing in an instant. He didn't even ask for details. He just grabbed his phone and motioned for me to stay in the hallway. "Lock your door," he said, his voice low but firm. I could hear him talking to the 911 operator as I sat on my bed, clutching my knees to my chest. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every distant car engine made my heart race. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The sirens grew louder until their flashing lights painted the walls of my room in streaks of red and blue. From my window, I could see 2 police cruisers pulling up to the curb. My dad stepped out onto the porch, waving them over and pointing toward the silver sedan across the street. I held my breath, watching as 2 officers approached the car cautiously, their hands hovering near their holsters. They shone their flashlights into the car, and for a moment, it looked like they were talking to someone inside. Then one of the officers motioned for the other to step back, and suddenly, they both drew their weapons. I couldn't see what was happening from my angle, but the tension in the air was palpable. My dad was standing frozen on the porch, his fists clenched at his sides. A moment later, the car's engine roared to life. The driver peeled out, tires screeching as the car sped down the street, narrowly missing one of the police cruisers. The officers ran back to their cars, but the sedan had a head start. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of its engine behind. The next few hours were a blur. The police stayed at our house, taking statements and reassuring us they'd do everything possible to catch the man. They explained that they'd run the car's plates and already had patrols combing the area. One of the officers, a woman with a calm and steady voice, crouched down to my level and said, "You're really brave. You did the right thing by telling your dad." I nodded, but her words didn't bring much comfort. I couldn't stop picturing the man's shadowy figure behind the wheel, watching, waiting. In the following days, things changed at home. My dad installed new locks, brighter motion sensor lights, and even got a security camera for the front porch. The police visited our house a few more times to check in, but the man and his car had vanished. A part of me was relieved, but another part stayed on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stopped walking anywhere alone and stayed inside as much as I could. Even months later, every time I saw a silver car, my stomach would twist into knots. It wasn't until almost a year later that I heard anything more about the man. My dad had come home one evening, holding a newspaper folded under his arm. He looked at me with a strange mix of relief and concern. "They caught him," he said quietly. "The guy who was in the car." He handed me the newspaper, and my hands shook as I unfolded it. The headline read, "Local man arrested in connection to multiple kidnapping attempts." Below it was a grainy black and white photo of the same face I'd seen that day, the man who called himself Uncle Robbie. The article said he'd been caught trying to lure another kid into his car at a park on the other side of town. This time, someone had managed to get his license plate, and it led the police straight to him. My dad sat down beside me as I read, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. And maybe I was. But the truth is, I've never really felt the same since. Even now, as an adult, I find myself glancing over my shoulder when I'm walking to my car or double-checking the locks at night. That day changed me, and I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, the kind of look that stays with you, no matter how much time passes. The hidden photos in the attic. I've debated for days about whether to post this, but I can't stop thinking about it. It feels like it's burned into my brain, and I need to tell someone. So, Here goes. A few weeks ago, my family and I were cleaning out my great-uncle's house after he passed away. He wasn't someone we were particularly close to, but since he didn't have kids or a spouse, it fell to us to sort out his belongings. The house was this old, creaky place that felt like it had been frozen in time. Faded wallpaper, furniture that smelled like dust and mildew, that sort of thing. I didn't think much of him growing up. He was quiet and kind of weird, but nothing that ever seemed alarming. At least, not until that day in the attic. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Low ceilings, dim lighting, and boxes stacked so high they looked like they'd topple over if you even glanced at them. I was up there with my sister, sorting through the usual junk. Old books, Christmas decorations, clothes that probably hadn't been touched in decades. But then, I noticed this old trunk tucked into the farthest corner, half buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. It wasn't locked, so I figured it'd just be more junk. But when I opened it, I immediately felt this wave of unease. Inside, there were stacks of old photos, hundreds of them, all black and white, neatly organized in envelopes. At first, it seemed harmless, like maybe he was just a photography enthusiast. But as I started looking through them, my stomach dropped. The photos weren't just random landscapes or family snapshots. They were all of women. Dozens of different women, taken at strange angles, like through windows, behind bushes, or in crowded places where they clearly didn't know they were being photographed. Some looked like they were just walking down the street. Others were sitting in their living rooms or working in their yards. It wasn't staged or professional. It felt voyeuristic, invasive. My hands started shaking as I went through more of them, and my sister noticed. She leaned over to look, and I'll never forget the way her face changed when she realized what we were seeing. We called my mom up to the attic, and when she saw the photos, she looked just as disturbed. He always had a camera, she said, almost to herself, like she was piecing together memories. That's when I remembered something from when I was a kid. He used to bring his camera to every family event, snapping pictures constantly. I always thought it was annoying, but harmless. Now, I was wondering if that was just the tip of the iceberg. Mom started flipping through the envelopes, but it wasn't just the photos that were in there. There were small, random items too. Hairpins, scraps of fabric, even a necklace. My stomach turned. Were these trophies? At that point, we were all feeling sick. My sister wanted to stop going through the trunk, but I couldn't. It was like I needed to know how deep this went. I picked up another envelope, and this one felt heavier. Inside, there was a notebook, small, with a cracked leather cover. It was filled with messy handwriting, pages and pages of dates and short descriptions. Things like red coat, library, 4:30 p.m., or blonde, park bench, smiled a dog. The entries weren't detailed, but they were enough to make it clear that he'd been keeping track of these women, probably before photographing them. Some of the entries had little X's next to them. I didn't want to think about what that might mean. What made it even worse was that some of the women in the photos looked vaguely familiar. I couldn't place them exactly, but their faces had that eerie sense of recognition, like maybe they'd lived nearby or worked in town. My mom was pale as a sheet by then. She kept saying, "This can't be real," but it was right there in front of us. My sister suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed at one of the photos. It was a woman sitting at a cafe table, staring directly at the camera. Her expression wasn't surprised or angry. It was blank, like she knew but didn't care. For some reason, that photo hit me harder than the rest. We couldn't stop staring at that photo. There was something about the way the woman looked directly at the camera that felt wrong. Every other photo was of someone caught off guard, oblivious to being watched. But not her. My sister muttered, "Do you think she knew him?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. But the more I looked at her face, the more uneasy I felt. It was like she was staring back at me through the photo. I tried to shake the feeling and moved on to another stack, but that image stuck in my mind. We eventually decided to take the trunk down to the living room to figure out what to do next. As we were carrying it, something clattered inside. I opened the lid and realized there was a false bottom. My mom hesitated but gave me a nod to open it. Underneath was a small box wrapped in cloth, and inside that was an old camera. It looked ancient, with a brass lens and worn leather straps. But the weirdest thing was that the camera still had film inside. My sister whispered, "Should we get it developed?" My mom looked horrified. "No," she said sharply. "We're not touching that." For once, I was glad she shut it down, because I had a horrible feeling about what might be on that roll of film. After that, the atmosphere in the house changed. None of us wanted to be there anymore, but we still had to finish clearing things out. The trunk stayed in the corner of the living room, like this awful, silent weight that no one wanted to acknowledge. My mom said she'd call the police in the morning, but for now, we just wanted to get through the rest of the day. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that camera. Every time I walked past it, I swore I felt it watching me, like it was alive somehow. Later that evening, while my mom was in the kitchen and my sister had gone home, I found myself alone with the trunk. I don't even know what possessed me to do it, but I opened it again. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just searching. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a single photo tucked into the lining of the lid. It was newer than the others, in color instead of black and white, and it was of a family. My family. We were all standing outside this very house, smiling at the camera. I don't even remember this photo being taken. My great-uncle wasn't in it. But in the window behind us, you could just barely make out a shadowy figure. I stared at that photo for what felt like forever. My hands were trembling so much I almost dropped it. The figure in the window wasn't detailed. It was just a dark outline, but it was enough to make my heart race. It was standing in what would have been the attic, right behind where we were sorting through all his belongings earlier that day. The strangest thing was that the photo looked recent, no more than a couple of years old, but my great-uncle had been bedridden for almost a decade before he died. There was no way he could have been up there taking this picture, let alone standing in that window. I showed the photo to my mom when she came back into the room, and she went dead silent. She stared at it for a long time, her lips pressed into a tight line. Then she just said, "We're leaving now." No explanation, no discussion. Just pure fear in her voice. I didn't argue. We grabbed what little we had brought with us, and she locked the house up like it was the last time she ever wanted to see it. As we drove away, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in that window, watching us go. We didn't go back to the house the next day. My mom called the police like she'd said she would, but they didn't seem to take her seriously. They sent someone to check the property, but we never heard back about it. Days turned into weeks, and the trunk stayed in the house, untouched. My mom refused to talk about what we found, and my sister started acting like it had never happened at all. But I couldn't let it go. I kept seeing that shadow in the window every time I closed my eyes, and the photo of my family haunted me. How did we not notice someone standing there when it was taken? And who, or what, was it? A few nights later, I woke up to a strange noise outside my window. It was this faint tapping, rhythmic but slow, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. My heart dropped into my stomach. I didn't want to look, but it was like I didn't have a choice. I pulled back the curtain, and there was nothing there. Just the empty yard and the dark silhouette of trees swaying in the wind. But as I turned away, I swear I saw a flicker of movement, just for a second, in the reflection of the glass. I didn't sleep at all that night. After that night, I started noticing other things. Small, almost imperceptible things that made me feel like I was losing my mind. Doors that I was sure I'd closed would be slightly ajar. Objects in my room seemed to move just a little, like a pen rolling a few inches across my desk or a book that was tilted at a different angle. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd been on edge ever since finding that trunk, and maybe my brain was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong. The final straw came a week later. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I heard a faint creak, like footsteps on old wood, coming from above me. My stomach turned. It sounded exactly like the creaks in the attic at my great uncle's house. I held my breath, hoping it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate, like someone or something was moving around up there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound was real, and it was coming from the attic. The problem was, my house didn't have an attic, or at least not one that I'd ever seen. It didn't make any sense, but the noise continued, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing above me. My chest tightened, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but I froze when I saw my screen. My phone's camera was open, and it was pointed at me. I hadn't touched the camera app. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone as I scrambled to close it. But before I could, I noticed something. In the corner of the screen, just over my shoulder, was the faint outline of a figure, dark and blurry, like a shadow standing in the doorway. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The doorway was empty, just the faint hum of the hallway light buzzing above. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I locked my phone and didn't move for what felt like hours, listening for the creaking sounds, but they were gone. The next morning, I was determined to find some kind of explanation. I searched the house from top to bottom, looking for anything that could account for the noises or the shadow I'd seen on my phone. I even checked the crawl space above the ceiling, but it was completely empty. No signs of rodents, no loose boards, nothing. It didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made me feel worse. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could explain away. I decided to go back to my great uncle's house. I know that sounds insane, but I needed closure. I thought maybe if I could figure out what was on that roll of film, it might answer some of the questions that had been haunting me. The house was cold and silent when I arrived, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The trunk was still in the living room, right where we'd left it. My hands were trembling as I picked up the camera, but I didn't even get the chance to open it. The moment I touched it, there was a loud, sharp knock at the front door. I froze, clutching the camera. The knock was so loud it echoed through the empty house, but when I peeked out the window, there was no one there. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to open the door, thinking maybe it was a neighbor or someone passing by. The porch was empty. No cars, no footsteps in the dirt driveway, nothing. Just the icy wind blowing dead leaves across the yard. I stepped outside to look around, but as I turned back toward the house, something caught my eye in the window. There was a shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing in the same attic window from the photo we'd found. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My first instinct was to run, but something stopped me. I don't know why, but I lifted the camera I was holding and aimed it at the window. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it as I clicked the shutter. The sound of the camera snapping echoed louder than it should have, like it filled the entire house. When I lowered the camera, the shadow was gone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I shoved the camera back into the trunk, slammed the door behind me, and ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, but I managed to drive away. As I sped down the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me, or worse, sitting in the back seat. But the road behind me was empty. When I got home, I told my mom everything. She listened in stunned silence, her face pale and drawn, and when I was done, she just said, "We're not going back there. Ever." She called someone to arrange for the house to be sold, and to this day, I don't know what happened to that trunk or its contents. Sometimes I think about the photos, especially the one with the shadow in the window, and I wonder if we disturbed something we were never meant to find. I still hear creaks at night sometimes, but I can't bring myself to check. I'm too afraid of what I might see. The Russian family feud. I guess I should start by saying that this all happened when I was 23, back in 2008. At the time, I was living in St. Petersburg with my family. Me, my parents, and my younger brother, Maxim. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but our family apartment had been passed down through generations. It wasn't extravagant, but it had character. Dark wooden floors that creaked under your feet, tall windows that let in the pale northern light, and a tiny balcony overlooking a quiet street. It was home in every sense of the word. My father worked as an engineer, and my mother was a teacher, so our life was steady, if unremarkable. Until Uncle Victor came into the picture. Uncle Victor was my father's younger brother. Growing up, I had only seen him at weddings or funerals, and even then, he always gave me this odd feeling. He had these pale, watery eyes that never seemed to smile, even when his mouth did. My dad used to joke that Victor could charm the devil himself if it meant getting his way. I didn't understand what he meant until that year, when my grandfather passed away. He had left the apartment to my dad, as the eldest son. Victor, who had been living elsewhere for years, decided this was unacceptable. He demanded that my father sell the apartment and split the money evenly. When my dad refused, saying he wanted to keep the home for the family, Victor declared war. At first, it was just snide comments and veiled insults during family gatherings. Victor would make digs about how my father was hoarding the inheritance and how it was unfair to the rest of the family. But then, things started escalating. We'd get anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Breathing on the other end, then a click. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. Victor wasn't exactly subtle. One day, I came home from work to find that someone had spray-painted "Thieves" in bold red letters across the door to our apartment. It was humiliating. My dad scrubbed at it for hours with a steel brush, his face set like stone, but he never said a word about it. Things went from bad to worse when Victor decided to take legal action. He claimed that the apartment was wrongfully inherited and should have been divided equally between the siblings. The courts in Russia were, and still are, notoriously slow and unpredictable. We spent months drowning in paperwork, attending hearings, and dealing with Victor's lawyer, who seemed to take sadistic pleasure in dragging the process out. I remember the tension in our apartment during that time. My mom would stay up late, chain-smoking on the balcony, her face drawn and tired. My dad, usually calm and patient, would snap at the smallest things. Even Maxim, who was only 16, started skipping school, saying he couldn't concentrate with all the chaos. Then came the day Victor went too far. We came home from a court hearing to find the lock on our apartment door had been changed. At first, my dad thought it was just a mistake, but when he called the building manager, the truth came out. Victor had bribed someone to let him change the lock, claiming he was the rightful owner of the apartment. I'll never forget the look on my dad's face when he realized what had happened. Shock, then fury. My mom started crying right there in the hallway, her sobs echoing in the stairwell. We ended up staying with a family friend that night, but the next morning, we came back with a locksmith to get inside. When the door finally opened, it felt like stepping into someone else's home. Everything was trashed. The drawers had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor, photo frames smashed, and the few valuables we had were gone. Victor didn't even try to deny it. "I was just taking what's mine," he said smugly when my dad confronted him. My dad lunged at him, and for the first time in my life, I saw him lose control. It took 2 neighbors to pull him off Victor. After that, things spiraled. Victor wasn't satisfied with just harassing us. He wanted to break us completely. He started spreading rumors in the neighborhood, telling anyone who'd listen that we were squatters in his apartment. People started looking at us differently. Even our landlord, who had no stake in the inheritance mess, began siding with Victor, probably because of his constant badgering. At one point, he tried to evict us, claiming we'd failed to pay rent, which was absurd since we owned the apartment outright. The legal battle dragged on, draining my parents financially and emotionally. We sold anything of value: my dad's vintage watch, my mom's jewelry, even Maxim's old guitar, to cover the legal fees. Meanwhile, Victor seemed to be thriving. He'd show up to court in tailored suits, smirking like he'd already won. It was maddening. My mom started having panic attacks. I'd hear her crying in the bathroom at night, muffling her sobs with a towel. My dad, who had always been our rock, looked like he'd aged 10 years in a matter of months. Even Maxim, usually so defiant, stopped arguing and withdrew into himself. One night, as I sat on the couch staring blankly at the television, my dad suddenly spoke. "We're not going to let him win," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't care how long it takes." It was the first time in months I'd seen a flicker of the man I grew up admiring. He started gathering evidence: old letters from my grandfather, utility bills in his name, anything that proved the apartment was rightfully ours. My mom, despite her anxiety, began helping him. It was like they'd decided together that if Victor was going to destroy our family, they'd go down fighting. Things started turning around when my dad discovered something Victor hadn't counted on. While digging through old documents, he found a notarized letter from my grandfather, dated years before his death. It clearly stated his intention to leave the apartment to my dad. My father handed it over to our lawyer, who lit up like she'd struck gold. "This changes everything," she said. Suddenly, Victor's case didn't look so airtight. But Victor, being Victor, wasn't about to give up without a fight. About a week later, we came home to find that the water and electricity in the apartment had been shut off. My dad called the utility companies, and they claimed someone had reported us as vacant. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. We spent 2 days living in the dark, using bottled water and candles until the utilities were restored. By then, my mom was on the verge of a breakdown. "He's going to kill us one way or another," she said, half joking, but the exhaustion in her voice made it clear she wasn't far from believing it. The final court hearing was like something out of a nightmare. Victor was there, smirking as always, while my parents sat stone-faced, clutching each other's hands. The judge reviewed the new evidence, asking pointed questions that Victor's lawyer stumbled to answer. When the ruling came down, it felt like time froze. The apartment was rightfully ours, the judge said. Victor's claim was dismissed. My dad let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding, and my mom started crying silently, her shoulders shaking. Victor, on the other hand, stormed out of the courtroom, muttering curses under his breath. You'd think that would have been the end of it, but Victor wasn't done making our lives miserable. Even after losing the case, he kept harassing us, calling my dad at work, leaving threatening notes on our door. Once, he even tried to confront my mom on her way home from the grocery store. My mom, surprisingly, didn't flinch. She told him in no uncertain terms that if he came near us again, she'd go straight to the police. It was the first time she'd stood up to him, and it seemed to shake him. Eventually, Victor's antics started losing their edge. My dad installed a security camera outside the apartment, and we filed a restraining order against him. The legal process was grueling, but it worked. Victor stopped showing up, stopped calling. For the first time in over a year, it felt like we could breathe again. My dad even fixed the door where Victor had spray painted it all those months ago. He painted over the damage, choosing a soft green color that made the hallway feel brighter, like a new start. Years later, I still think about that time and how it changed us. My parents were never quite the same. They grew more cautious, more guarded, but they also grew closer. Maxim eventually went on to study law, saying he wanted to help people like us, who had been trampled by greed and injustice. As for Victor, we heard through the grapevine that he left the city shortly after losing the case. No one's heard from him since. Part of me still feels a twinge of anger when I think about everything he put us through, but mostly, I feel relief. We made it through. And even though that year was hell, it taught me what family really means. Standing together, even when the world seems hell-bent on tearing you apart.